Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to this semester's final Law Science event. Welcome also to all those who will rewatch the session later. I'm Daniel Hefke. I'm a JSD candidate at Cornell Law School. I am the moderator for the session. Before turning to today's speaker, Professor Poul Kjaer, let me briefly introduce the Law Science Project to everyone. We are an academic initiative coordinated by a group of US doctoral candidates who share the same belief in legal methodologies. Legal methodologies are often understood as a discipline distinct from sciences, traditionally consisting of doctrinal analysis and normative questions. And through the series of interdisciplinary talks, we aim to show that legal research can be improved and benefit from scientific methodologies that provide systematic ways to approach questions. If you want to learn more about the Law Science Project, please visit our website and join our email list. I think one of our coordinators will drop the link in the chat box right now. And that's actually a good point to introduce the other coordinators. We have Simon Sun. He's a SJD at Indiana University Maurer School of Law, and he's the co-founder of this initiative. And we also have Marilyn Hush. She's a JSD candidate from University of Virginia School of Law. We also have representatives at diverse law schools in the US, such as UC Berkeley, UPenn, University of Illinois, University of Washington, Columbia, and Fordham. If you're interested in getting involved, we are always looking for new representatives. We also host a blog on legal methodology, which is called the Legal Method Lab, for which we are always searching new editors. So if you're interested in becoming either of these, please reach out to us. But let's turn to our speaker for today. I could think of no better speaker for an interdisciplinary initiative than Poul Kjaer. He holds degrees in law, sociology, and political science, including a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and a habilitation from the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. He has been visiting fellow at several research institutions, including the Paris Institute for Advanced Study, the London School of Economics and Political Science, and Harvard University. He serves currently as a professor at the Copenhagen Business School, and he leads the European Research Council Advanced Grant Project Global Value Chain Law, which investigates the links between colonial law and contemporary global regulation. His academic work focuses on public and private global governance and political economy from a legal theory and historical sociology angle. He has authored and edited many books. The last one is a collection of many great essays from many great professors on the law of political economy, which I can only recommend highly to anyone who hasn't read it. And today he will actually speak to us on this topic in a talk called Two Tales of Law of Political Economy. Before we start, please be reminded that we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please prepare questions. The event will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can either raise your hand or write down your questions in the chat box, and then I will read them out to you. But now, without further ado, thank you so much for joining, and the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the kind invitation as well. This is a very exciting and in many ways global event in this new online universe that we are operating in. So a true pleasure. Two Tales of Law and Political Economy. The reasons for that, this title is that I'm going to start out by looking into the differences between what we call the European approach and a US-American approach to the law of political economy. And I will be a bit simplifying here because when I talk about the US approach to law of political economy, I essentially mean the kind of LPE approach coming out of Yale, which most of you probably are quite familiar with. So I will start out with pointing out what I see as 5 differences between the European approach and the US approach. Of course, I'm biased here because I'm representing the other team, so to say, the European team. And the work I myself have been doing is, I would argue, quite different than what you find from the US Yale-style kind of approach to law of political economy. After that, I'm going to delve into bigger themes about the relationship, what is the common foundations, what is actually the issues that law political economy is actually dealing with. And then finally going into some historical explorations about how to explore law and political economy issues in various historical epochs, and also maybe look a little bit into the future. Now, the 5 differences between European and US approaches to law political economy. Before we get to that, I should maybe say that, as was already mentioned in the kind introduction, I'm very much basing myself on the book, The Law, Political Economy, Transformation in the Function of Law, published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. But there's also on this list of other publications which are out there and which, of course, can be downloaded and read afterwards. But that is like the kind of material I'm basing myself on. Law, political economy. The interesting thing here, of course, the first difference between the US approach and the EU approach, or the European approach, is essentially that one is the label, the name, what we call it, because in the American one, it's called Law and Political Economy, and what I've been doing in Europe together with others is called Law of Political Economy. And one could wonder, does this really matter? Maybe it doesn't really matter, but also it might indicate something after all. And I think one thing it indicates is that if you see US LPE talking about law and political economy, then both in scholarship, it's very much a conceptualization of you have legal scholarship and then you have political economy scholarship as 2 different disciplinary kind of strands, which then are combined. Also, looking at as a social phenomenon that you have legal processes and legal systems, legal frameworks out there, and you have something called political economy out there separate from that somehow. In the European touch or take on it, however, it's somewhat different because the idea is very much that we're not really talking about law on one side and political economy on the other side. Rather, we are talking about the law's internal reconstruction of political economy. That means that it's a legal vocabulary, it's legal concepts, it's the legal scholarship which internally reconstructs what law thinks about what is political economy. That means it's actually an internal process within the legal system, but within the legal discourse, within the legal profession, rather than one which is actually about combining an external and an internal. And I think that has already here, we see some quite profound methodological and consequences of this in many ways, because one remains, the EU one, or the European one remains a firmly legal exercise because it's only about the internal reconstruction, whereas the other one is more interdisciplinary. So that's a first difference. A second difference is in the origin. If you look at US LPE, there's sort of stuff coming from Yale and elsewhere, of course, as well, but which was initiated at Yale, then it's very much like a classical legal realism from the US tradition, which is the source, the historical source of this. And you, of course, also have critical legal studies, but also a very strong Marxist kind of dimension to the work being done and coming out of Yale. If you look at the LPE from Europe instead, then typically the first book one considers as representing a law of political economy is, in fact, Hegel's Philosophy of Right, published in 1820, which in my eyes essentially is one big book about law and political economy. It is essentially an outline of a theory and also a description of society through a lens of law and political economy. But you also have, of course, scholars like Max Weber. And in the mid-20th century, you had influential scholars like Otto Kahn-Freund, Hugo Sinsheimer, and Franz Neumann. And you also had autoliberalists. And for those who might not know, because this is very, so to say, intra-European stuff, Kahn-Freund, Sinsheimer, Franz Neumann, they were all either considered themselves as socialists or social democrats, whereas the autoliberals were very much seeing themselves as like conservatives. And that means also that law and political economy in an European context is not really easily categorizable between left and right in terms of politics. And I think it's something which seeks to go beyond the left and right distinctions. But the key thing here, or key takeaway, is that in a European context, law and political economy is not really considered something new. It is considered something which has been around for at least 200 years. And not long ago at X, former called Twitter, I believe, there was some Yale LPE scholars writing throwing in a link saying, yes, now there's also people in Europe who's interested in LPE. And someone replied back, yes, have you heard about a guy called Max Weber? You know, And of course, the idea is that this is something new, is in the European context somewhat different. So whereas I think the Yale School tends to organize themselves around the idea that LPE is really something completely new, which I would say it is not. So that's another difference. A third difference is, I think, and now it gets a little bit more challenging maybe, is on the concept of society. When I read US LPE stuff, then I'm often looking at or wondering what is actually the notion of society which is behind the scholarship being conducted. And it seems, first of all, simply to assume that it's a nation-state society we are talking about. It's the US-American society we are talking about. There's incredibly little work which is actually going beyond the United States. It's very US-centric in many ways, but implicitly with that, the assumption is also that the key organizing form of the economy in the 21st century is still the nation state. If you look at European law and political economy, of course, it inspires in the sense that it emerges from out of Europe, and when it emerges out of Europe, of course, it has a specific European angle, catering to European problems, etc., etc. But it's also a form of scholarship which is explicitly understanding itself as global, in the sense that in principle, it is insights which should be possible to provide or to be used or to be deployed anywhere in the world. But also more importantly than that, I think, is that in a very strong focus on the interactions between, say, local, national, and transnational ways of organizing the economy. You have, and also the local implications of global processes. That means, for example, if you look at global value chains, for example, or it could be in any sector, high tech, or it could be textiles or whatever, it's very difficult to analyze any sector of the economy today without having, you can call it global or you can call it transnational kind of perspective, because there's interlinkages across borders in one way or the other, or at least there's competition. Or if the salaries are being pressed one place, it's probably also having effects on salaries somewhere else, etc., etc. And you have migration issues, etc., etc. So in that sense, you cannot really, that would be the starting point, work with a nations or purely nation-state centric notion of society if you want to do this sort of studies. Rather, you have to understand there's maybe local societies, there's national societies, and there's transnational dimensions to society. So in that sense, we are also essentially departing from a concept of world society, like the full globe is what we are operating with within which then there is different layers, different segments, etc., etc. And that also means that a bit more to that is that the starting point, and that's back to Hegel basically, but also to Max Weber and to Niklas Luhmann and Jürgen Habermas and many others of the greatest sociologists of the last 100, 200 years, is the idea is that society is essentially what we call a functionally differentiated society. That is that you have political, economic, educational, religious, scientific, etc. processes going on in society. And that's really where the law and LPE comes in, is how does law regulates the interactions between these different spheres of society. And the link between politics and economy is only one of these many different dimensions. Maybe the most important one, but it's only one. And I think that is very much the idea that this is the starting point. A fourth difference is concerned with what we call the function and concept of law. And in US law and political economy literature, there is very much the starting point is this idea that the law is constitutive of the economy. And I think that is completely true. But from an European law and political economy perspective, you would say yes, but in fact, law might also be considered constitutive for, in fact, all social phenomena, not particularly the economy, but it could also be religion, it could be science, it could be politics, etc. So it's nothing which is particular for the economy, but rather something which law exercises throughout society to all sorts of social phenomena. And there's nothing which is particularly limited to the economy. Another point is here is that what does constitutive actually mean? Because in a first kind of approach, you would say that means it creates it, or it's created through law. And I think that is actually implying an overreach of law, because I don't really think that law can create the economy. What it can give is rather, or any other social phenomenon, what law can do is rather that law can give a social phenomenon a particular form. That means that law becomes a form-giving exercise. That is, you have a social interaction, and then through law, we can, for example, contract law, for example, we can denote it as a particular economic exchange. Or because we can call it an administrative act, we can denote it as a public political exchange. Or through a certain definition, we can call it a religious exchange or a scientific exchange, etc., etc. That means what law does is actually it denotes different social phenomena and give them a particular form. And that means also when we talk about being constitutive of something, we are actually talking about an epistemological function, because it's about observing a given social phenomenon in a particular way. We can observe a social phenomenon as economic, as religious, as scientific, as XYZ. And law helps enabling us to do that by categorizing things and putting them into boxes. So that's what is meant with being constitutive in this sense. And as I said, this is not only something which is related to the economy, but something you see throughout society. And that also links up to the idea is that if you have a society which is characterized between different spheres, economy, politics, religion, science, etc., then this sort of separation between different spheres, but also interactions and transfers between them, is very much something which is regulated through law. We can take an example which is outside law and political economy in the strict sense, say something like evangelism in the schools. That is like the imposure of like religious beliefs in the school system. There will be a typical class where law then comes in and regulates both separating, say, scientific teaching from religious teaching, and when is what allowed to do what, etc. That is handling like an interaction between education and religion. But we could also, of course, if you take LPE strictly, then it's very much the question of like incursion of private interests into the public domain. That's a classical kind of feature of economic interests into political decision making. Is it so the idea is that you both have to separate the two spheres of economy and politics, but you also have to somehow link them up again, which you also do, for example, through taxation. Taxation is a legal form through which you take money from the private sector and you transfer them to the state. So all these questions is about separating particular spheres of society, but also allowing transfers between them within a legal form. So the idea is basically that is what LPE is all about. That is to separate the political and the economic, but also to reconnect them again inside a legal form. So that is basically what the function of law becomes from an European LPE perspective. Fifth difference and final difference, I will try to point it. There's more differences, but the last one, in one of the recent articles from on the LPE side from the US, they raised a question about who has power or who should have power. And I found that very interesting in the sense that for me, that becomes a very naturalist conceptualization of power. That is, a power is something that you can sort of say, you can take it, it's a physical thing, and you can move it from person A to person B, or you can hand it over, you can give it, etc. It becomes something which is essentially for me based an articulation of power, which is essentially a pre-modern understanding of mechanical understanding of what power is all about. In the European perspective, the point of departure is twofold. On the one hand, an idea of societal power, and that is meaning if you take Michel Foucault, for example, but also Max Weber, then the idea will be that power is intrinsic to all social relations. That is, doesn't matter where they are, what type of relations they are, there's always power involved in all social relations. And that's fair enough, but that of course also means to end up with a very, very broad and expanded idea of power, because power is everywhere. And if power is everywhere, well, it doesn't really help us very much to say power is everywhere. We need something more specific to work with. And here we can then distinguish that in the with the concept of what I call legally constituted public power. That is very much inspired by the works of Franz Neumann from the mid-20th century. And here the idea is that, yes, that power is everywhere. Power is part of all social relations. It's part of all dimensions of society. But there's also a particular form of power, which we can call public power. And that is a type of power which is, first of all, abstracted and generalized. And abstracted means essentially that it's detached from particular individuals, from particular persons. A government of law, not of men, is the same logic. That is the separation of exercise of public power from whoever the particular individuals who are running the government. That's also what is built into classical notions of the state of law, or in German original words, Rechtsstaat or Rechtsstaatlichkeit. The other part is that it's generalized. That is, generalized power is something which is deployed across the board, from Alaska to Florida or wherever you are in the world, in a generalized manner. That is, the same norms are applied to everybody at the same time. So it's both abstracted and generalized. And the key thing here is that that sort of public power is legally constituted because it's law which makes it abstract, and it's law which makes it generalized. And that means also, and now we are back to the point from before, that law is not only constitutive of the economy, law is also constitutive of the political, because it's law which separates a particular form of power, which is what I call legally constituted public power, from the general pool of societal power. And I think that is a different way of thinking about power. And that also means that power becomes something like public power. I describe in one of my texts as a public power is islands of public power exist in an ocean of private power. That means if you're talking about that we live in a global society, then all of the dimensions of that global society are characterized by private power. But inside that broader pool, you then have small islands of public power. And this means essentially turning a category of power upside down, because the image I put up here is from Hobbes's Leviathan, which probably all of you know, his famous book from the 17th century. And here you have this classical depiction of the state being the king, which encapsulates all the smaller bodies inside him. And inside him is the private power, but it's the big, so the public power is the frame which encapsulates the private power. But what I'm arguing for here is that we need to turn that image upside down. Actually, instead of having the public power encapsulating the private power, it is the public power which swims in an ocean of private power. So we need to turn this idea upside down, and that will be a different way of talking about power, I believe. Now, on that background, one can proceed to the bigger questions about what is the LPE debate, no matter if you talk about the American version or the European version, or for that matter, any other version, about. And I think it's important to contextualize this debate and see, where did we have this debate before? Is this a new thing? Because in my eyes, this is definitely not a new thing. This has been going on for many hundred years, this debate, just in different variants and in different articulations, etc. But also, what are the bigger questions behind it? And essentially, if you were to take a classical distinction between feudal and modern societies, then at least in a Western tradition, we would see the move from feudalism to modernity as a move from what we call society characterized by an idea of a holistic society to a society which is based on differentiation. What I mean with that is that if you have a notion of a holistic society, you have this idea that the various parts of society are added up in one holistic whole. And that is something typically in a pre-modern society is understood as being made by God or whatever kind of religious kind of mythology that you rely yourself on. But if you depart from the notion of differentiation, instead you say society consists of many different elements, segments, and they are not necessarily adding up to something holistic or something comprehensive or something singular. You just have a big flow of different structures out there. And this, and basically 99.9% of all legal and social theory and anything related to that written in the last at least 200 years subscribes either to the one idea or to the other idea, either explicitly or implicitly in their assumptions about. That is basically, you can read it out of the first line of almost any text. Is this someone who departs from an assumption of a society being holistic, or is it someone who departs from a society being mere assemblage of differentiations, but nothing else? And that is the two ways, so that basically all the stuff we read are based on one of these two assumptions. And you'll see that, for example, in the legal theory, classically between a Republican versus liberal notions of society, but you also see it in political theory. Back in the 1990s, you had this big debate between communitarians versus liberals. But interestingly enough, for our talk here on LPE, you also see it in economics, historically speaking, because if you go back to the 19th century, the most dominant way of articulating the economic discipline at the time was the so-called German historical school. And on the other hand, you had analytical economics, which is the sort of analytical economics which today are the dominant form of economics. And the German historical school specifically departed from this idea is that actually the world was made out of cultural units like nations, or some typically nations. You had as cultural units, and inside those you would then have market economic activities going on. But what happens with the analytical economics is then they say, no, actually we do not really deal with the cultural dimension anymore. We are only working with markets, and we understand markets as something non-cultural, even though that's of course not the case, but that was in their idea. And they would also subscribe to a differentiation approach in this. The problem with this is, of course, that the notion of the market is not really escaping the holistic. It might think it escapes a holistic approach to society, but it doesn't really, because the notion of the market is based on equilibrium, an idea of equilibrium, that is that something is in balance, and there's typically supply and demand, which is in balance, or should be in the balance, or potentially could be in balance. And with this thing is essentially they are also subscribing to a holistic notion of society. They are just changing from the cultural unit of the nation to the cultural unit of the market. But the holistic thinking actually continues to operate. So in that sense, you have this tension going on. Another tension we see this similar is also in political economy literature, because back in 1944, Hayek, which you probably all know, but also Karl Polanyi, both of them wrote their main book, or published their main book, The Road to Serfdom for Hayek and The Great Transformation of Polanyi. And those two books essentially ask the same question, namely, why did totalitarianism emerge and why was it so successful? That is, why did National Socialism, Fascism, Stalinism, etc. emerge, and why was it successful? So exactly the same question posed at exactly the same time, but their answer was exactly opposite. Because Hayek said the reason for this happening was that the differentiation between the political and economic has broken down. There was too little differentiation in society. We need to separate the economic and the political processes. And the idea that when the politics intervene into the economy, then it's when it goes wrong. And Polanyi's answer was exactly the opposite. He says, no, the reasons why this happened was there was too much differentiation between the economic and the political dimensions of society. So it's all about reintegrating them again. That's how we avoid that sort of issues. So they gave exact opposite questions to the same answers to the same question. But interestingly enough, Franz Neumann also in 1944, the same year, published his book Behemoth, which was also dealing with the same question: why did National Socialism emerge and why was it successful? And he essentially says, yes, the problem was that there was not really, there was, so to say, too much differentiation and too little differentiation at the same time, because what he argued is that it was the legal form separating economic and political processes, but also reconnecting them, which had broken down. That means that the way that you organize interactions between the state and the economy had broken down through the organization through law of this interaction had broken down. And that was the problem. So he basically argues that what we need to do is, yes, we need to separate the economic from the political, but we also need to reconnect them again via the legal form. So in that sense, Franz Neumann is actually providing a third way and a third alternative between Hayek and Polanyi. And I think that's also a golden middle way, if you wish, if you ask me. So in that sense, my work is very much centered around doing a Franz Neumann approach fitting to the 21st century. Now, that leads to the question of methodology. That is, what sort of methodology are we working on here when we talk about LPE in Europe? And here, the methodological basis is what I call historical sociology of law. That is, that you do legal studies, but you do it in a sociological way, meaning it's about the external effects of the law in society, but you do this historically. That is, it's about historical reconstructions over long time spans. So this is very much a way in terms of methodology to combine legal, sociological, and historical kind of approaches within one. And I'm just going to briefly outline 3 historical phases here. They are a bit, so say, catering to Europe to a certain extent, and in a US American, but also in a Latin American and a East Asian, etc. Kind of from a perspective, this would look different. But so bear with me for the Eurocentric dimension of this for a minute, because it would look different depending where you are in the world, of course. But the interesting thing is that if you look at Europe, the first of the 3 phases I would like to touch upon is what we call the interwar period, that is between the First and the Second World War, 1918 to 49. And here, especially in Europe, but actually also many places elsewhere in the world, we had what we call the turn to corporatism. That is the idea that essentially the term corporatism became the buzzword of the day. Everyone was talking about corporatism all the time, and everyone wanted to be corporatist, and it was cool to be corporatist, and corporatism was the solutions to all problems in society. And the interesting thing is that you had corporatism as both as an socialist idea, an anarchist idea, a reactionary Catholic idea, as a fascist idea, as a national socialist idea. Corporatism came in all versions of the political spectrum. So in that sense, it was something which everyone was subscribing to, though in different versions. But the interesting thing is that all these different versions basically saw corporatism both as an ideology, but also as a concrete social praxis. And they all shared the idea that they wanted to, so to say, after the shattering developments of the First World War, they wanted to, so to say, recreate society as a holistic society. The idea is that we can actually make society back to a holistic entity again. And that also means they all departed from society, specifically the concept of society, rather than from the concept of the state. It was not the state who was supposed to establish society or run society. No, society had to run itself. And that's also something you see in totalitarian ideologies, for example, because when they'll say National Socialists or fascists or Stalinists or Leninists or whoever talk about the total state, then they actually like remove the distinction between the state and society. And it's actually what they talk about is the full society. They don't talk about the state because the distinction does not exist anymore. So in that sense, they depart from society, not from the state. And it's all built up with this idea is that the core element of society should be what they call interest representation. That is that different professions, different groups, different social groups in society should have their interest represented through and into this organic whole, which is constituted through corporatism. At the same time, they all, both in their left wing and their right wing versions, were based on the idea of anti-legalism, like law was an obstacle, law was a problem. You don't really need law because law is a hindering political action and the unfolding of the political constitution of society. So law was basically downgraded. And of course, if you look back, this turn to corporatism, which unfolded throughout the 1920s and 30s in many different ways and forms, is essentially what led to what we call a de-differentiation between the economy and politics, because the legal separation of the economy from politics very much either disappeared or was eroded in this period. And that, of course, then turned to some very unfortunate consequences afterwards. A second one is what we call neo-corporatist reconstitution. in the post-World War II era, that is typically what is associated with the welfare state, the Keynesian welfare state, emerging in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. And here you see an idea, but also not only as an idea, articulated idea, but also as a social practice and a reality, that the state for the first time gains this status as a primus inter pares, that is, that the state becomes the central coordinating body of society that had not really existed before in most places in the world. That is a rather new thing, which emerged mid-20th century. At the same time that you had profession-based autonomy around the state, that is, medical doctors would have their own gremiums to run the health system. University professors would have their own gremiums to run the universities, etc. So you would have what we could call the state in its core sense, but you would also have all these other forms of organization out there linked up to the state. And that's in this expanded state, the state becomes what we call a conglomerate, in the sense that it's not only about the state in a narrow sense, but this wider body of islands of public power, which were there. You find them inside the universities, in the health sector, in business associations, etc. This broader setup, and also that means that at least in the Western European context, that for the first time something like labor law, for example, becomes actually regulated by the public rather than through contracts. That is, and through private law, it becomes something which is regulated primarily through public law, or at least becomes framed by public law to a certain extent. So this is where we have what we call the emergence of the golden age nation state. And I think it's very important to notice that this is really a new thing post-1945. It didn't really exist before. If you talk again with Franz Neumann about legally constituted public power as being abstract and generalized, then this is something which happened post-1945. Also in the United States, by the way, when Eisenhower sent federal troops to Alabama to end segregation in the late 50s, that was actually the first time you saw that norms were generalized throughout the United States, because before then you would have, so to say, the South states would have their own set of norms, and the North states, there are the other sets of norms, and the federal norms would be very few and very difficult to implement across the board throughout the American space. So this is something, this like unified and a coherent set of norms applied from Alaska to Florida is something which actually emerged largely, well, with the New Deal onwards, like especially after the Second World War. And you saw that similarly in most Western European contexts. This sort of like unified set of generalized norms applied across the board for the full society is largely a 1945 phenomenon. It's quite a new thing, which did not exist before. At least before it existed as an aspiration, but not really as a reality. So this is this which emerged, and this is here where law comes in, both in separating the political and economic dimensions of society, but also linking them together inside this broader legal framework. This sort of system has, however, framework, however, broke down pretty fast. From the 1970s onwards, we've had this, what some would call the turn to neoliberalism, others would call it the turn to governance, which is my preferred term, which emerged gradually. And essentially, you know the story, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, etc., several others, made a move towards deregulation, decentralization, increased privatization, reduction of taxes, rolling back of the state, etc. But also you saw a broad host of international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, OECD, the EU, etc., implementing that sort of theories across the board. And here we are back to the national, transnational kind of dimension to this. And I think the core element of the governance paradigm is, in the American context, essentially law and economics. In Europe, it looks a bit different, but essentially it's law and economics and associated non-legal paradigms like new public management, public choice, etc., which were implemented up through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and onwards. And the interesting thing is here that actually meant, because the starting point for these theories, either everything is a market, or we can understand everything in market terms, even if it's not actually an economic activity. We can still use economic methodology and conceptuality to understand it and to regulate it, etc. So in that sense, the point here is that to see everything in economic terms. And doing so also means that the idea is actually to return to society, and the idea it's not the state, but it's society, which is actually our core interest point, and what actually is what drives us forward. And that also means that these theories specifically were aimed at breaking down the public-private divide. That means the state should run like a company, and the public agencies, etc., should run as if they were companies, even if they were not. And that means also that you specifically attempted to blur the divide between public and private. And that also means also partly due to deregulation, but also to what we call a sectorial outlook. That is that you have the emergence of very specific regulatory frameworks for very specific legal phenomena. That could be chemicals regulation or doping in sport, etc. All sorts of small micromanagerial kind of frameworks emerging, which were not really having, a broader societal view or perspective, but was very much focused specifically. Also, banking regulation is a good example as well, where it becomes about the daily operation of a bank, but not really about the broader societal effect of banking activity. So you have this fragmentation emerging, which has been a big characterization of our societies for the last 50 years or so. And you have a very much a focus on output and efficiency. It's about increasing efficiency. That's the purpose of legal regulation. But also a turn at the same time to informality and pragmatism. It's about what works, not what is normatively right, etc. It's about its efficiency. And all these elements were something which you actually also had in corporatist ideas in the 1920s and 30s, interestingly enough. It should also work. Mussolini should make the trains run on time. It's about efficiency. It's not about legal procedures. There is only society. That is that we talk about the full holistic society. We don't talk about the state and the rest of society. The distinction does not exist anymore, etc. So it shares many of the features of the corporatist paradigm from the 20s and the 30s. The sort of basic structure which emerged from the 1970s onwards. And that, of course, has some consequences. With Duncan Kennedy, we can say that this is where the public-private divide is getting undermined. But we also see something interesting. That is that you see areas which before was regulated through administrative law. We now see this is very much being taken over by what we call regulatory networks and the private exercise of public authority. That is, for example, through self-regulation. Boeing apparently are self-regulating their own and self-inspecting themselves when they build airplanes today. We learned recently, maybe not a terribly clever idea, also as we have learned recently, but this idea is actually that you can go back, that you can base yourself on some sort of self-regulation, and it's actually the more or less privatized networks which set standards, which inspect standards and norms, etc. Is a very core element in our societal evolution over the last 40 years or so. But interesting enough, it's not only about, so to say, an expansion of, say, private logics and private power and private capital and private money into the public, because that is one dimension of this. But it also actually goes the other way, because administrative law and public power is also going into what was traditionally part of the private domain. And if you look at Northwestern Europe over the last 40 years, you have this very interesting move towards what we call micromanagement capacities. If you are unemployed in, say, Denmark or Finland or the Netherlands 40 years ago, the state would provide you with unemployment money, and you would every 2 weeks have to go and get a stamp, and then you will get another 2 weeks of unemployment money. But if you today get unemployed in those countries, they would call you into a meeting. They will make a full individualized plan for you on your skills, your capabilities, what skills you need to upgrade, what courses you need, what sort of sector would be the future one for you to be employed in, etc., etc. They will do a full personalized kind of operation vis-a-vis your person. And that was a capacity that states did not have in the 1960s, but that capacity states have today. And that means, so when we talk about, say, neoliberalism and Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and so on, the idea is typically that states has become weaker and states has been rolled back and etc. But actually states are far stronger today than they were 50 years ago, because they can do a lot of stuff today that they could not do 50 years ago. You could also go into a kindergarten, for example. If you go into a public kindergarten now, then there will be rules for the noise level, for the sort of food that you can serve, the number of employees there has to be, the education of the employees, the number of square meters available for each child, etc., etc., and the level of danger in the playground will be assessed, etc., etc. The state will micro-organize and micromanage down to the smallest detail a space such as a kindergarten. And that's something the state could not do 50 years ago, but it can do it today. So in that sense, we have far stronger state capabilities today. And that also means that the states have taken over micromanagement in places they did not used to micromanage. Hospitals were maybe publicly funded 50 years ago, but essentially the medical profession would self-organize and run the hospitals themselves. But today they are run by the state in a far more micromanagerial way. The same with universities, they would be run by the professors in the old days. And now the ministries of education and science would decide down to the smallest detail which research areas gets money allocated, new positions, which education should be open, which one should be closed, etc., etc. So that means that the state has moved out in areas where the state were not formally present, but are present now. At the same time as we have the incursion of private interests into what was typically state domains. So what it very much means is that this divide between the public and the private is not what it used to be. And I think that is one of the problems our societies in plural are faced or fighting with. And that also means that this is very much about the suspension of the sort of legal frameworks which was making these divides in the old days. But these frameworks are no longer, either they are no longer present, or they are at least not working as they used to do. So that also have led to some very bad consequences. Again, if you look at the European context, if you look at Greece prior to 2008, they had a severe economic crisis, as you probably know, from 2008 onwards in Greece. And here, essentially, you saw that governance meets corporatism, in the sense that Greece was a fairly not developed economy in European comparison before 2008, and actually had many features which more looked like what you had in the 1920s and 30s in, say, Scandinavia or in Germany or elsewhere, in the sense that you had a strong cooperative setup of the economy. At the same time, you also had modern governance features, mainly introduced by international organizations like the OECD and the IMF and the World Bank, who said you have to do X, Y, Z in order to get money from us and from the EU as well. And you had actually features both from the corporate classical corporatism and then the newcomers of governance merging together, and that produced a very unfortunate cocktail. And essentially also it was a re-emergence of clientelism and informal and paternalistic networks as the way of running the state. And what it comes down to is that this turn to governance essentially challenges the normative integrity, but also the functional capacity of both politics and the economy, but also of law itself, because law's function is not really being fulfilled. And of course, we have a lot of evidence consequences of this: the financial crisis 2007, politically 2016, keyword Donald Trump, etc. Also Brexit, which very much links up to this, because essentially what we have now is a new call for returning to a holistic society. That is what many nationalist movements and populist movements are calling for. And of course, the question is the alternative to that some sort of reconstitution of this double function of both separating but also reconnecting at the same time the economic and political dimensions of society? Or do we need something else than law to do this? Because maybe law can actually not do it anymore, but that's an open question. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. We have Now enter the Q&A session. We have about 10 minutes left. We have a group of international students. I'm sure there will be lots of questions and comments. Again, the event will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube. So you can either raise your hand and ask the questions directly or write them down in the chat box. And in that case, I will read them out for you. Right. Okay, yeah, Simon, then you can go first.
Yeah, I'll kick off, sort of start the conversation, because I was and I think I chatted with the professor before about my research is mostly about the digital society. So a lot of my questions comes from the role of private technology companies that I think the LPE movement within the United States have been trying to capture. And they came up with the term informational capitalism, and basically talking about how these private companies can commodify data and influence society through a form of power. And they have different terms, but one way to phrase it is algorithmic power. So the first question is, mostly when you were introducing the different concept of power, and traditionally we have the distinction between public and private, but then right now the private power, specifically in the United States, have the extensive amount of influence within what people view and think. So I'm curious about how can we reconstruct the understanding, or I think two things. One is, how does the US sort of scholarship on LPE sort of contribute to the development of this new type of power, and how would you think from a European perspective this could change? The second is the role of law itself, and this comes with another part of the research that talks about blockchain, and blockchain itself as constructing another sense of decentralized way to organize. But then the role of law became a quite challenging concept within blockchain governance itself. So again, I'm curious about sort of these sort of more internationally connected world that we're facing. How can we have a dialogue on these different conceptions of law and to move forward as a methodology?
Thank you for this. I think the starting point for the first one is to acknowledge that you cannot really deal with this issue from a purely national perspective. And I mean, and that is like challenging for most lawyers already, because 99% of the lawyers on planet Earth are working within classical national legal setups. And I think that's also should be a key part of legal education, for example, that is not how you can actually grasp these problems and issues by operating in a purely national sense. The other thing is, I think it's very interesting to look at, say, competition law as antitrust as one of the core issues. The big hope is now antitrust can deal with these issues of big tech, etc. And I think that's completely true. And I think also there is, because this is not like this is a new problem in society, because I mean, we had big companies dominating before. American antitrust legislation was made 130 years ago for a reason, because there was big monopolies or quasi-monopolies or duopoles, etc. in place. It was just in oil, or it was in steel, or it was in whatever instead. So, and I think, but the key thing is this, and I think actually Franz Neumann is very interesting here, because he has a beautiful text on the constitutional worth of antitrust. And the idea is that actually to understand antitrust, or as it is called in Europe, competition law, as something which has constitutional worth, that is, as something which is central to the constitution of society, because it's about breaking up private power in society and ensuring that public power remains the dominant form of power, because when you break up the private power in smaller pieces, the state can actually put itself through. So in that sense, these are quite classical ideas, which then, of course, would have to be remodeled and reformed to deal with the particular substantial issues of technology and of big tech, etc. So you will have to do that in a revised fashion, and also with the international, transnational dimension to it. And I think, so that is in many ways the way to go. And I think both US and European LPE very much agrees on this point. But of course, it comes down to this law and economics point, which was behind lots of antitrust regulation over the last 40 years, which is only about economic growth and about maximizing utility. But the idea that the key purpose of antitrust law is actually nothing to do with economic growth or maximizing utility. It's about preventing the assembling of private power in society. That is the purpose of the primary purpose of antitrust law. But that means you have and that was a completely standard European way of looking at antitrust law until 20 years ago. And then it got rid of it, inspired by the United States, and now everyone regrets and wants to go back. So, yeah. The other thing is, of course, if you talk about blockchain and this sort of things and the regulation of technologies, law has always been regulating technology. There's nothing new in that, like anything from railways to airplanes, and there's all sorts of stuff out there regulated also very detailed through law. The interesting thing is, I think that a lot of these technological developments are speeding up society. Things goes very fast, and law is very slow. And law always has to be slow because law is about stabilizing normative expectations in society and stabilizing norms. So you cannot really change the norms all the time because then the function of law kind of gets lost in this. And at the same time, you have to keep up with these fast developments. So the law has to be slow and fast at the same time, which is basically the tension which law is dealing with, which is law is really and how do you get out of that? That's a good question. There's a lot of studies now, and also of digitalization of law itself, in courts, etc., using artificial intelligence in courts and all that sort of stuff, in order for law to keep up with the rest. And I think law needs to take this seriously. The time gap between the speed of development inside the legal system and in the surrounding society has to be there, but it cannot grow too big because then the relevance of the law disappears. So, and I think actually you can measure this. You can go out empirically and look at this. How fast is the law and how fast is it the object that they are trying to regulate? And I think you could do interesting stuff around that.
I would actually just follow up with a very short follow-up question, which would be, so one thing that was very interesting to me was your differentiation at the beginning between basically the different understandings of LPE in Europe and in US, because I think that speaks to something a lot of us who are doing comparative law always know, that we always have to translate meanings between countries. A lot of us working in two different kind of legal systems also know the experience. So I really appreciate that. And my question would be, do you have a sense or an explanation for that different kind of understanding? Because my feeling in the US is very clearly that it emerged very much as a response to law and economics. So it's very much kind of a political self-positioning, right? So if you say I'm an LPE scholar, it's not always clear what that means, but it clearly means you are left of center and you're against law and economics, right? So it's kind of an academic self-positioning. So I'm just interested if you have some take of why that is, why the difference.
In a somewhat polemical article, one of those listed in one of the early slides I wrote, where I was commenting on American LPE, I said that they are not Marxists, they are Leninists, in the sense that for Lenin was primarily a political revolutionary, and then he was secondarily a scholar. Whereas for Marx, he was primarily a scholar and then secondarily a revolutionary. And what I mean with this is that LPE, United States, is more of a political project than it's a scholarly project. And I think in Europe that is different. It's primarily a scholarly project, which then might have some political normative implications, but that's a secondary thing. And I think that's a very important difference. Is this primary a political ideological operation, or is it a scientific academic scholarly operation? And that's also where I find some of the problems in the US LPE, because you rarely make very good scholarship if it's primarily an ideological kind of operation you are involved in. And that links then to, of course, because law and economics had also influences in Europe, but the influence, the impact in the United States has been far, far bigger. And that means also that the context where they're doing their fighting is different, no? So they are fighting against law and economics in a far more serious way, if you wish, than in Europe, because they are in the end of the day, the influence of law and economics has been somewhat superficial. But I think beneath is this, that actually Yale-style LPE shares with their biggest adversary, law and economics, that they are methodological individualist. It's about the individuals at the end of the day. They don't really talk in institutions, they talk about individuals. Europeans always talk about institutions, about structures, about systems, about states, about etc. Whereas Americans only talk about individuals. So in that sense, and I think that's actually where the big divide between the two lies.
Great. That's super interesting. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Before I let you go, I would ask you if you're able to maybe switch on your camera so we can take a screenshot for our socials.
If I know how to do it, yes.
You just have to, like, everyone who's able to, Simon will do the screenshot. If you're able to switch on your camera, it would be appreciated.
My camera, yes.
Perfect. Yes, that
Right.
looks great. So
to the right, and then
no, I can take care of the picture.
okay.
Yep. All right, 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Let's take another one just in case. 1, 2, 3. Perfect.
Again, then thank you so much, Professor, for this very
Thank
insightful.
you.
Thank you everyone for attending. Hopefully see you all again next semester.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you, Professor.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.